So thanks to everyone for hanging in. We were originally going to connect with you all back in June. We had to postpone. We were wanting to hold you in anticipation, but we're here and we're still happy to be doing sort of the launch of the Youth Reconnect program guide. So to get started, Lindsay, do you want to switch to the next slide, please? Great. So I'm going to take us through a little bit of an overview for how we're going to spend our hour and a half or so together. And we're really looking forward to this being a bit of a conversation today that's going to be a little bit split up. So we're going to start off with Dave, who's going to chat briefly about the Making the Shift demonstration lab, which is sort of the, as I call it, the umbrella project which Youth Reconnect fits under. So Dave's going to kick us off, and then we'll get to Mike, sort of the main event, the entree for today, who's going to chat about all his experiences, observations, reflections in running a Youth Reconnect program for, I think, about 10 years or so. Mike, I'm not sure I've got that right, but we're quite excited to hear his insights. It's always a great time to chat with Mike. So, and then of course we want to make sure we save time to chat with you all. If you have any thoughts, we're open to feedback, ideas about this work. So we'll make sure we do that, and then we'll wrap up. So before we kind of jump into things, we wanted to know sort of what sector or background folks are joining us from today. We're mindful that, and as you'll hear, Youth Reconnect sort of draws on sort of a systems approach to youth homelessness prevention. So we're just a little bit nosy to know what systems folks might be representing today. So Lindsay, we have 3 polls. We're going to queue up our first one here and ask you to just describe as best as you can within these little ticky boxes, what role you're representing today. We'll give folks a couple more seconds and then check out the results. Okay, so our highest sort of representation are folks from the homelessness sector, followed closely by youth services. We have a good chunk of folks from sort of funding or policy and planning backgrounds, followed by folks in the education system, and then folks who are just generally interested. So that's a nice mix of folks, and I'm pleased to see we have 14% of the folks watching from the education system, just given the lots of things going on in schools as of late, but also for everyone who's just joining us in today. This is fantastic. So thanks for joining us and for letting us know what sector you're representing us from. I wonder, we can flip to the next slide, Lindsay. Oh, a little bit of shifting going on here. We're trying to make this like virtually interactive, but it can take a little bit of back and forth. So having said that, we're going to switch to David now, who's he's got this new role with the way home, where he's going to be working pretty close with the team that's a part of the Making the Shift demonstration lab. But Dave's been with the way home for a few years now, quite a few years. So he's had, I think, some great time observing sort of the development of Making the Shift, and now kind of coming with a more hands-on approach. So Dave, we'd love to hear from you. What the heck is this Making the Shift thing? Why are we talking about it? Why it exists in the first place, and what are some of the great impacts and outcomes that are happening so far, with the caveat that we're still learning, observing, figuring this all out. We'd love to hear that from you.
Great, thanks. Happy to share that, and more maybe. Depends on where I go.
That's great.
I'm feeling reckless today, so let's see where this takes us. So I think some important contextual pieces with respect to Youth Reconnect and why we're here, and that so we're on to the next slide. Sorry, my bad. We released in 2018 was a What Would It Take report, where we heard from more than 100 young people from across Canada who we were sort of given the opportunity and trusted with their stories around what would have prevented their homeless experience from happening. And, you know, more than anything, we were struck by these moments where they were able to really clearly articulate had an intervention been available to them, they likely wouldn't have experienced homelessness in that moment. And so that taught us that there are interventions and there are spaces where young people are looking for support. And how do we then round out those supports for young people? And this is, again, the degree of program models that we're supporting with respect to the Making the Shift demonstration project. And you showed us that, by building a response that is primarily reactive, we not only condemn youth to hardship, but we actually ensure it. And the need for a proactive approach that is timely, that is moves faster and quicker, and responds to young people who are at risk of homelessness can ensure a quick exit from homelessness, but also can ensure they avoid homelessness altogether. And so, just released is a breakout report that came out of that initial 2018 What Would It Take report, which distills down the important components of how we should be engaging with schools and the role of schools within youth homelessness prevention. And I want to make that really, really clear, in that there's a role for schools. There is also a role for communities and how we support schools to ensure that they can play a better role in youth homelessness prevention. We've relied on schools to be a place of learning, but we also should be relying on schools to be a community. And so how do we as community support those schools to be that and to react in that way for young people? Next slide, please. So Making the Shift is it's an innovation in youth homelessness prevention through the refinement of practice models. And not just refinement, this is sort of the testing and the execution of practice models that have been identified, not just by us, but by community partners across Canada as the sort of the components, the ingredients that every community should have in order to move to youth homelessness prevention. So those are Housing First for Youth, Family and Natural Supports, and what we're here to talk about today, Youth Reconnect. There's also a component within the MTS DEMS work, which is focused on research and evaluation of the effectiveness of these models. So what are we learning from implementation of these models? What are we learning from the realities on the ground of implementing these models in a number of different communities? And what we want to gain out of that is real knowledge mobilization and tools. So we have to remind ourselves sometimes that MTS-DEM is not only supporting young people, but it's also supporting communities to support young people, and that we want to make tools, learnings, the pain points, the challenges, the successes of MTS-DEM's demonstration projects really palatable at the community level so that we can create a readiness for uptake of these program models. And we couldn't do this without our funding partners and without support from Employment and Skills Development Canada. The Making the Shift demonstration project is funded through the Employment and Skills Strategy. Next slide, please. So who is involved? Who is Making the Shift demonstration project? It is a partnership between the Canadian Observatory, Away Home Canada, and community partners in both Ontario and Alberta. And the work of the Making the Shift is part of a larger piece of work. So Erika mentioned an umbrella. I'm going to mention a larger umbrella of the Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, which is funded by the Network of Centers of Excellence. So specifically, I want to focus on our community partners. So we've got community partners across or in Alberta and Ontario who really allowed themselves and us to dig deep into what implementation and execution of these new program models means for them. And they're doing this with a willingness to learn, to grow, to change, but they're doing this with foregrounding the importance of, if we do this well, communities behind us can do this well as well. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of the scope of the work that's happening, there are 10 communities and 12 organizations in Alberta and Ontario who are prototyping prevention-based program models. So like I said, there's Housing First for Youth, there is Family and Natural Supports, which is both in Ontario and in Alberta, and there is Youth Reconnect, which is happening in Hamilton, Ontario. And we're excited to announce that as part of the Making the Shift demonstration project, we're adding additional communities. So we're adding not only a Kelowna Housing First for Youth project, an upstream project. So that is true school-based interventions in both St. John's, Newfoundland, and Kelowna. And we're adding another Toronto Housing First for Youth site. Next slide, please. And so again, this is our reminder. This is the reminder of the outcomes that we've seen to date. So beyond the tools and the resources and the learnings and the opportunity to engage with community partners across Canada, we're working with young people, and our community partners are really accelerating this work with young people. So far we've worked with 1,160 young people that have been impacted by our work. Again, we've got some broad ESDC outcomes that we've been informing, but it's important to highlight that 70% of those young people have strengthened connections with family. More than 1,100 young people are employed or remained in school. And that's the really sort of galvanizing factor that we have in our partnership with ESDC and the Youth Employment and Skills Strategy, is how do we then not only ensure stability for these young people, but also attach them to labor and employment or training so they can, again, see themselves as successful in their own transition to adulthood. And again, there's broad connections across the MTS-DEMS work across a number of government departments. So we're working really closely with Reaching Home as well, and ensuring that they're aware of the outcomes that we're achieving with MTS-DEMS, because 874 young people have improved housing because of MTS-DEMS. And so this is all this whole layer of work that is on top of the reality that we're sort of making this work palatable and realistic for communities and how we design that. And so that's being done through program models and toolkits and the Youth Reconnect program model and case management tools and assessment tools. And all these things are sort of these building blocks for communities. And how do we move forward together? Next slide, please. And so getting to the Youth Reconnect program guide. So Mike and Erika, who you're seeing on your screens, played a really important role in this. So I don't want to lose sight of that opportunity to give them a shout out in this incredible work, because again, it's the Youth Reconnect program guide resonates in a number of different levels, and it's because it's touched by individuals who have a real passion for this work. And so, but you know, in June when we launched this, we knew that it was going to be one of these opportunities to dig deep with communities, but also pull community and systems together. So it's important that we also acknowledge the fact that there are youth contributors within the development of the program guide as well. And so this sort of means that we have this temperature read and this seal of approval from young people who've experienced homelessness, or we're still experiencing homelessness, and that the guide and the tools and the elements that we've provided in the guide really sort of resonate for them and how they would have liked to have been worked with. So it also is a document that really highlights the importance of this early work in Hamilton, but the important work that Mike has done in Niagara, and the international work that's happened and the international learnings that have happened because of the Youth Reconnect program model. So it really distills down sort of not only local realities and local successes, but the international successes of this program model and what it means for the application within communities. So the Youth Reconnect program guide also talks about sort of those key elements, those key components of the program, what those elements are, and the objectives within each of those components. So again, making that realistic and palatable at the community level so they can see themselves within it. And I've read lots of program guides. This one, I see community in it, and I see each of your communities in it. And so that's like the really important sort of reality for this program guide, is that I think you too can see yourself within it. But it also provides case examples of Youth Reconnect in practice. So the necessary conditions that need to be there for implementation for communities. And it's not meant to be designed as a holistic how-to. It's meant to be sort of nurturing and a work in progress. And if you could write these things in pencil, because they change on an ongoing basis, we would have, but you can't. But that's sort of the idea around social innovation, is that we're continuing to learn and grow with feedback from yourselves at the community level for how these things can be designed and redesigned and applied given the nuances of each community context. And so the Youth Reconnect program guide is also meant for sort of broad application and sort of I guess, marinating at a number of different levels across the community. So it's meant for schools, it's meant for community partners, it's meant for funders, it's also meant for governments. And I think it really resonates across all four of those. And so you'll see within it, as you dig through it, sort of the successes and regardless of the approach taken by communities, the building and nurturing of community partnerships and how Youth Reconnect can be that systems response and that way to pull partners in to, again, bring your system into kind of in a cohesive manner that allows your community to build around something like Youth Reconnect. And so, again, I really encourage this to be a piece of reading for practitioners, policy professionals, young people, even. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, David. That was a really great highlight. And I feel like one thing I appreciate about working with you is your many analogies and metaphors. And I think marinating is the one that I really hear a lot and enjoy. I'm a marinator myself. But yeah, thanks again for giving us that sort of context and where Youth Reconnect comes from and what it's attached to, and also for really emphasizing that we didn't just kind of sit around one day and make this up. We definitely are inspired by the existing work that's already been happening and proceeding before us, one of which is definitely with Mike down in the Raft in Niagara. So, and yeah, we're really appreciative that we were able to kind of take the lessons that he's learned, take our own lessons, put those together, but then to know that we're going to continue to adapt and evolve this work. Having said that, definitely as someone that helped to pull the guide together, was very relieved when we shared the doc with Mike for feedback, and we're like, we don't know what he's going to think. He's got all this experience and we totally missed the mark, but we got 2 thumbs up, and so we were like, okay, we know what the heck we're talking about. So yeah, so thanks so much for that. And before we move on, we do have another poll. Clearly, the 3 of us are keeners on Youth Reconnect, but we're curious to know from the participants today the level of interest that folks have in a Youth Reconnect program. So whether it's someone that's like, I just heard of Youth Reconnect 10 minutes ago, and here I am, all the way to maybe folks that are thinking about or who are implementing a program. So Lindsay, if you don't mind queuing up our second of 3 polls. We'll take another minute and then check out the results. All right. Okay. So most folks are pretty new to YR. Ooh, we can have lots of fun. And then some folks following that are a bit familiar and are still wanting to get some more info. And then we've got about close to a quarter who are very interested, whether it's about implementation or perhaps about how it fits within a broader sort of system of care. And then a small percentage who are sort of not sure, and they're going to wait and see what happens after this webinar, how interested they are. So that's great. So most folks are brand new to Youth Reconnect, or very relatively new. That's great. Well, then on that note, you've come to the right spot, Lindsay. We want to go to the next slide. We're going to move along to Mike, who, as I said earlier, I think is sort of our main event. Oh, I think there's a bit of a lag in the slides. Well, maybe we'll just keep going. Well, on that note, we're going to, as I said, we're going to move on to Mike, and just a bit of a primer about Mike. So as I mentioned, he's got about 10 years of experience doing Youth Reconnect. So we're really quite pleased that he was so keen to want to collaborate with us on this webinar. And we're interested, or I at least am interested to hear a little bit about how things have evolved during that time and how things have changed a little bit and what you've been doing. And we did have a couple chats before we got into doing this webinar. Mike and I were chatting, and planning and prepping for this. And I just want to sort of give some heads up as to some of the things that we talked about, that I think you're going to chat about today, just to give folks some sort of a bit of a primer for what topics you might cover. So some of the things that I thought were interesting that you said were sort of important things to talk about or cover were, one is you talked about sort of what are the underlying assumptions or like the philosophy of the service that sort of underpin, and I would think would be a super important first step to take before even thinking about designing or developing a Youth Reconnect program? What are the sort of what's the philosophy of the service that you're going to operate it on? From there, you also chatted about the importance of and not sort of taking for granted, really understanding the client and who you're working with, and sort of relying on research and data to inform that for you, again, in helping you to design and then operate the program. And then one thing that we kind of talk about a lot, and that I think folks are going to be really interested in, and it speaks to sort of the systems approach, is how are you collaborating with schools and the education sector as a really important part of Youth Reconnect and an early intervention approach. So we know why it's important, or that it's important, but I mean, you've had the insight of like, how do you actually do it? What's that first connection look like? How do you approach? How are you maintaining that relationship? Because it's one thing to establish a relationship, but to keep it going, that's a whole other ball game. So we're looking to hear, or hoping to hear about that from you. And then we had chatted about this as a group. We'd also like to turn into COVID. Obviously, thinking about how does Youth Reconnect operate amidst a pandemic? What does Youth Reconnect mean in regards to the pandemic? And Dave, we're definitely going to want to pull you into this chat too, given the insights that you'll have with your team as well of Way Home. You have the education sector report that was just released today, and also not too long ago was the youth sector and COVID report, which gave some insights as to sort of action steps in response to supporting youth amid COVID. So I won't go on, but we're going to turn over to you, Mike, to chat a little bit about your experience thus far developing and delivering Youth Reconnect.
Yeah, thanks, Erika. Although you pretty much gave my whole talk, so we should just probably wrap it up. And
they're teasers.
Hey?
They're just teasers.
Just teasers. Yeah, I think if we can advance maybe 2 slides to the Niagara map. And then one there. Okay, so just quickly about myself. I've been executive director of the Raft now for approximately 15 years, and we'll get a little bit, it plays into how I ended up coming to Youth Reconnect, but just want to sort of set the table right off the bat and say this is all of my opinion. It's informed opinion, I like to think, by 15 years of working in the sector, and I'm a big fan of research and reading and then following my own stats, but ultimately it is my opinion, and it could look different for you. So just one caveat there. And the second caveat is I have kissed the Blarney Stone. And so that's just take what you want from that. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Niagara, because I think geography plays an important role in system programming, and it definitely played a role in how we developed this program. This is the Niagara region. It's a peninsula, so it's surrounded on 3 sides by water. On the far side, to the right hand of your screen, that's actually the border with Buffalo, with the Americans. And if you sort of look at Niagara, one thing to notice, it's really divided. So there's actually 12 municipal governments and then 1 regional government. So we have a 2-tiered system of government, which makes decision making and planning interesting. But I mean, it also goes to show that it all can get done. And in fact, I found it actually advantageous to have this many types of government, because if someone says no to me, I just go to the next municipality and you can get a yes there. So there's benefits in having multiple politicians at the table. The Niagara region itself has about 450,000 people in it. So it's it feels small in Ontario, but I mean, comparatively, it's a fairly decent sized population for Canada. And then if you look, there's really 1 large city, which is St. Catharines, large being relative. It sits at about 130, 140,000 people. And then as you can see, all of the green, largely surrounded by a rural area, which produces some excellent wines, if anyone's interested. I mean, we get paid to make sure we state that in every, it's part of our tourism thing. So yeah, particularly the Gamay from Cave Springs is delicious. So if you look at the Niagara region, one thing to kind of notice is, so we have St. Catharines, and it's sort of at the top. It's bordering Lake Ontario, which is on the top part of your map there. And then down on the far side, on the American border, to the far bottom on the right-hand side is the town of Fort Erie. Now there's a highway system, which I probably should have picked a better map, but anyways, there's a highway system that goes from Fort Erie, follows the border, follows the Niagara River up, and then hits St. Catharines and then shoots across the top of the map below Lake Ontario and ends up in Hamilton and eventually ends up in Toronto. That's our main corridor for transportation, and that also plays a big role. To give you a sense of distance, we're based in St. Catharines, so if I was driving to Fort Erie, I mean, that's a full Tim Hortons cup of coffee. Now you're talking a good 30, 40 minutes of driving, a solid cup of coffee. So it's not, it's a wide geography, and that's on a major highway. That's a 400 series highway, right? We're not talking back roads, that's straight highway driving. So the whole region is actually quite large when it comes to transportation. And then some of the areas often to your, if you look sort of to the left, that's all sort of back roads, right? So you can multiply how long it takes you to get anywhere by a factor, right? Just by sort of heading into the south, into the more rural areas. And so that's largely the Niagara region. Like I said, it's quite a lovely place to live, and like I said, it has good wines. Next slide. So I thought I'd kind of start with the with kind of what the problem looked like, and just to kind of give you a little run up until how I ended up even at the problem. So when I started back in 2006 with the Raft, we were a small sort of 8-bed shelter in kind of a condemned-ish building, and it was everybody's pretty jammed. We would regularly have, although we only had 8 beds actual, and even that's questionable if you call what we consider beds. But we had 8 of them, and we would cram another 5 or 6 into there. So I mean, regularly on a night we'd have 8 beds, but we'd actually be sleeping somewhere between 10 and 15 kids into this building that, like I said, when we moved out of it, was actually torn down because it was unusable. So we were lucky. We received some federal money to be able to move into a new building, and which we were able to do fairly quickly after I started. So about a year and a half after I started, we actually moved into a beautiful building, 24 beds. It had actually been purposely built as a shelter, so it was actually built as a women's shelter. The women's shelter had grown out of it, but I mean, ideal. I still to this day love that building compared to where we were. And it was designed, so literally we closed the doors in the one, and it was a few blocks away. So we walked from the old Raft down the street with all our belongings on our back into the building, and we never missed a night of service. The kids literally were able to just go back into the beds, and life looked good. We went from 8, 10 beds to 24 beds. But then quickly within about I don't even think it was a year. It was pretty soon after we were full again, right? Like we were back to the old problem I had at the other building where we were full, and now I'm at 24 beds and we're full. And a lot of work went into getting to this 24 bed, and there's absolutely zero appetite at all in the community to allow me to purchase a 35 bed shelter or 50 bed shelter or whatever. So anyways, now we get to the problem. What do I do? I can't expand. I've already done that. So then we started to, let's say that we didn't come to prevention because we thought prevention was we were sold on prevention and we were sort of missionaries for prevention. It wasn't that at all. It's just simply the fact that we couldn't go do the thing that people told us to do because we'd already done it. So we were sort of forced to look at things differently. And that's kind of how we came to really sort of, what are we doing? What is the goal? What do we want to achieve? And this is the stuff that kind of becomes important when you're looking at the program. So one of the things, really the overriding goal for me at this point in time, was reducing the number of kids who needed shelter, and particularly my shelter, right? And so when we started looking around, a couple things, like when we started really sort of asking the youth where they were from and what they were hoping for, and really what did they want from us, right? I mean, and it's kind of funny. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing to think that we didn't know this already, but largely we didn't. That's just the way things are. So when we started actually looking who was coming into our shelter and what they actually wanted. A couple things came up. So one was just that there's a complete lack of support for youth outside of the cities. Services were largely centralized, and I think I'll make a point later on in my presentation, but largely, traditional knowledge, or what we tell ourselves is that homelessness is an urban issue. And so there was really no reason to look into the rural communities to provide any kind of service there. So it wasn't that people saw a problem and didn't do anything about it, it's just they never even thought to look, because there's certain factors that played in that we ended up encountering that made it actually an urban issue. And so, so I was saying that we have the support centers, the concentrated urban centers, kind of makes sense. One thing that was particularly troubling, and still troubles me to this day, was when we started really looking and speaking to our clients and found out a clear division started to occur in the stories. And the kids who are coming to us from St. Catharines, so who had grown up in St. Catharines, gone to school in St. Catharines, they had a completely different story of homelessness than the kids who were coming to us from outside of St. Catharines. So more of the rural communities, like that 45-minute drive, Fulton, Morton, Scotty Place, Fort Erie. And what we were finding is that they didn't know about us. And so they kind of just had run out of resources in their own community, and then sort of just took a gamble that there was something out there if they went to a bigger city for support, but they didn't know what they were actually looking for. And we'll talk a little bit about that later too. But they would show up, and so largely they would show up by bus. And I say this, I'm not sure if it's so much true, how much transportation has changed in the 10 years, but definitely back then, St. Catharines is sort of the hub for the Niagara region, for transportation, for the bus terminal. And I could say to anyone, this is kind of my bus station challenge, is that I could take you to the Niagara, to the St. Catharines bus terminal, sit you down outside of the out-of-town buses, and I bet without any difficulty, you would be able to tell me which kids were new to the city, just by watching how they came off the bus. It's actually pretty simple. And what we were finding, the stories of the kids who came by that method, is that we weren't their first choice. They didn't know about us. They didn't even know that our kind of services existed largely, or even how to access them. And so there are other people who are waiting for these kids to get off the bus, right? And so these are, pimps, drug dealers. I mean, these kids are gold, right? And actually, when we look at certain things, I was amazed at you think there's certain things about people, like it's hard to believe that there's people who are waiting for these kids. It isn't just a passive malignancy. It isn't just a passively waiting for bad things to happen. These are active agents who are actively looking to exploit and abuse the kids who came off the bus. So they had a reason for doing it. And one of the things is, I mean, we looked at some of the stuff they did. What do they offer? They offer a place to stay, something to eat, companionship. And you know what? We even had where drug dealers and gangs were basically recruiting these kids and then enrolling them in the local high school, because the police wouldn't know, because they were unknown at this point. And so they basically had a clean slate. They could go in, they could recruit, they could sell their drugs, and do all kinds of other things before they eventually got found out, right? And then they became damaged goods, and then they would show up at our door. And so that was really the reality of the kids who were coming from outside of St. Catharines to us. And so that also definitely became something we wanted to put an end to. Probably more than anything, all the other things that go personally, that's the thing I wanted to put an end to. That's why I was saying, like, there's no regional system of prevention. There really wasn't any prevention whatsoever. It's pretty classic. Shelters. You come in the shelter, and the shelter works with you while you're in the shelter. Gives you something to eat, place to stay, and hopefully helps you with some housing searches. Maybe connects you to other programs, depending. But largely, that's kind of the world we were living in. And everything was very reactive. So when I noticed what programs were being designed and why we were doing things, it was a very reactive system with very little empirical data or research or evidence even verifying why we were doing things. So it's just kind of how we always did them. And everybody would have their random anecdotal story about Johnny who did this, and it really worked out well for him. So we did a whole program based on this one story that someone heard once and continues to repeat. So I find that's how a lot of the programs in the social sectors end up coming in based on these stories, but no one's actually looked to see if there's anything behind the story. We just accept them. When I did look for research, one of the things I at that time, back in around 2007, homelessness, if you found something about youth homelessness, it was largely around panhandling and youth employment and sort of that gray market, and mostly out of the big cities. So there's very little information at all in any of the North American literature that I could find that had to do with youth homelessness, and particularly youth homelessness that happened in rural communities, and then anything to do with programming. It was really around how they were making a living panhandling in Toronto, and what the Toronto had passed a bylaw back then, basically trying to ban panhandlers and loiterers, and how that was affecting their their income. That's kind of the majority of the information is available, so not particularly useful to us. So we started doing our own investigations. If we could go to the next slide. So this is some of the things that when we started looking in, and some of the things we found to be true, and that, and now, and the funny, this seemed quite revolutionary at times, and I'm happy to say that it feels a little dated, which I'm happy about, because it's not 2007, and this information has now actually been out in the discourse for a while now, so I'm kind of happy. So if this seems like, oh, I've heard this before, that's excellent, because I can tell you this was all brand new in 2007. No one seemed to have an understanding of it. So one of the things we found was that 80% of the Niagara youth conflict at home, which I think now is pretty well, I mean, definitely with the Away Home and COH, I mean, with the work that's been done there, that's definitely a stat. And that was our local stat, but I mean, it's verifiable across Canada. The reports that are coming seem to basically, that's true. And of that, 67 was a direct conflict between a parent and the child as the reason for leaving. This is an important thing, and we didn't quite understand. We understood some of it, but we didn't understand all of it, and I still don't think we quite understand it. And I'll get to that at the very end as to what I think the most important thing going forward is that youth who are homeless do not identify themselves as homeless. And so when we go back to what I was talking about those kids getting off the bus, they just weren't living at home, but they did not consider themselves homeless. And so when we advertised ourselves as a homeless service, it wasn't where there's no keyword, there's nothing to Google, right? There's no way for them to find the information. They didn't see us. They were colorblind to us because they didn't consider themselves homeless. So why would they come to a homeless shelter? They just needed some help, right? So that becomes extremely important. But also really informed the way we had to deliver a program, because we had to deliver a program in a way that wasn't focused on homelessness as the deliverable. It was really focused on the youth as coming to them instead of waiting for them to come to us. And how we defined the service wasn't around homelessness, it was about support in your community. So it really changed the tone of the work we were doing. Median age was 16. Which is important because most 16-year-olds, I mean, that's prime school age. And this is where the school starts to come in, our focus on school. I mean, once we understood where the majority of the youth, what ages they were, we could start identifying where they were. So that became important. Probably, again, common knowledge that it's usually not one thing, right? I mean, I've rarely met the kid that's come into my shelter where, it's just been a bad day. There's real issues. Whether or not they're willing to disclose them to you, they might just tell you it's a bad day. But I mean, when you build a relationship and you get to know these kids, there's some really horrible things that have happened in their lives, and nothing that I could ever relate to in my own experience. So I'm just in awe of their ability to just walk in the day. For some of them, it's absolutely frightening. So anyways, we actually, when we started asking them about where they were from and what they'd been doing just prior to being homeless, because again, we never even thought to ask what happened, like who were you before you became homeless? We just looked at you as a homeless person. We found out that the majority actually been students. You know, they were living fairly normal student lives. Like, I mean, the experiences were, like I said, that they had their own experiences when it came to their home lives and other things. But I mean, largely, they looked like every other kid that was going to school. And so that's when it was really kind of our aha moment that schools would be a critical component to this problem. And then finally, over 50% of the kids who were accessing our shelter back in 2007 were actually not from St. Catharines. And so that really challenged the assumption we had. Because we thought all homelessness was urban, so we assumed everybody was largely coming from St. Catharines. So when we found out that, in fact, the majority were actually coming from outside of St. Catharines and coming to us, I mean, that also became an important factor for us. So next slide, please. And I think we have a little bit of a little video here that kind of describes the program. It's much more entertaining to me.
And suddenly, you no longer have a home to go to. You stay with friends and relatives, but you eventually wear out your welcome. You may not realize it yet, but you are now homeless. Your friends and family may not fully understand the situation either. That's when you end up traveling to an urban center in order to feed yourself and find a place to sleep. You're now away from your community and you've left school, which means you are no longer a student, but a homeless teen. You now spend your days on the streets and are exposed to drug abuse, sexual exploitation, and more. This is a very difficult situation to get out of. The challenges you now face are the reasons why people who are first homeless as teenagers often become chronically homeless adults. In the Niagara region, before a young person leaves their own community and leaves school, Youth Reconnect works with schools and teachers to identify at-risk youth with the goal of keeping them in their own community, getting them housing, and keeping them in school. This effectively stops the cycle of chronic homelessness before it even begins. The intervention process isn't simple, but it starts with satisfying a basic human need: stable housing. Youth Reconnect first tries to resolve conflicts at home, and then moves on to friends and extended family. If these attempts fail, youth are assisted in finding independent housing. Once they have a safe place to live, and if they've left school, program representatives communicate with their teachers and their school boards to make a smooth transition back to school. Youth Reconnect also links youth to specialized services and helps them develop a social safety net. These interventions prevent youth from feeling isolated from their community and identifying more with street persons out of a need for acceptance. Attachment to school and housed living is reinforced before the cycle of homelessness can begin. In 2008, the year the Youth Reconnect program began, 500 students accessed Raft shelters. In 2017, less than 160 students needed to use these same shelters. That's a 68% reduction in youth homelessness, a dramatic decline. The cost of shelters in local government is also greatly reduced, with fewer young people requiring their services. The statistics from shelters tell us that the program is working, and so do the youth who have used the services. Individuals who enter the program feel safer and more supported, more able to access mental health and social services, more integrated into their community, and more knowledgeable about how to access community resources. Since Youth Reconnect began, there have been far fewer homeless youth in Niagara. That means we can also look forward to a future with fewer homeless adults.
Perfect. And so, I mean, largely that is the program as it kind of plays out. I have a slide later where you can we'll go over it quickly, but I really kind of want to focus less on the mechanics of that, that we'll just have that as an understanding, but what went into, because I think that's important if you're looking at designing your own program. So if we can go to the next slide then. Yeah, so okay, here's some of the, now we're getting into sort of the meat of it. I think, having done this work for a while and working with many different people, that there are largely two poles in social services. There are the people who believe that the intervention has to happen at the person level, that there's something that we can do with people individually to improve them that will then improve their situation. And then I think on the other pole, we have people who think that there's a problem with the system and that the system largely limits choice for people, and that if we can change the system, the people will do their own getting well. So I am much on the system side. I look at the problem and I see system all over it. We have not designed a good system. It doesn't make any sense largely. It isn't based on any kind of data or research that I could find. So, I really believe that if we can make a system work for people and we provide them with enough resources, they will make good choices. So as an example, it wouldn't be the first time I've heard talking to some staff that were other people that are working in housing that saying, we took so-and-so over to look at an apartment, and you know what, he didn't like it. And I'm like, oh yeah, he wants a better neighborhood. Well, how's that a crazy decision? But then you get the laugh because, first of all, he can't afford a baby, so he's just gonna have to get used to what we have for him. But that's not a fair choice. That isn't, it's a matter of money. Canada's a rich country, but we have no money for dignity, and that's largely the truth, right? So when we give people actual options, real options, they will make the right decisions. I know a lot of people look at mental health and addictions and think that's a main driver for homelessness, but in my experience, it happens after homelessness. The main driver in addictions and mental health is because you became homeless, not before. So we can always blame the individual, and all I find that really does is just take the responsibility off of us. It's not my service, when I talk about successes, and I can sort of hold up an example of one of our youth who did really well, and I can say, oh look, they, without our support, where would they be? But then you don't see me taking any responsibility for all the people that we failed, right? And ultimately it's us that failed them, the system that failed them. They didn't fail themselves. Half of them didn't have a fair chance to begin with. So anyways, if you're going to design a program like this, I'm coming from a system side, and if you're more on the side where you think it's working with the individual, and the individual, if we could just change the faults in them, this probably isn't going to work for you. So, and then we get on to, what was I really looking to do? Reduce shelter use, right? And so that's critical. Depending on what your, where you are, or what your role is in your community, you might have a different goal, right? I mean, if my goal is to end youth homelessness, I'm not sure that initially that's what I was really looking to do. I was really looking to reduce youth needing my shelter particularly. And so that really impacts how you go about delivering your intervention, and importantly, how you track your intervention. I mean, like for example, if I was going to just look at general reductions in youth homelessness, maybe it wouldn't show up in my shelter. If my intervention is happening in the wrong place, it might be successful at some other outcome, but it might not be noticeable where I'm looking for it. And so really understanding what you're trying to achieve and how you think those interventions are going to link and where the data should show up is important. So, I mean, really understanding what your goal is. I mean, like I said, you could dig a trench with a screwdriver, but why would you? And so, as I was saying back with the when we were talking about the transportation and the rural communities, and I said we were going to get a little more. It's really this immigration, right? Became pretty simply one of the biggest things that we had to figure a way around. And so, again, we found out that rural youth homelessness is prevalent as urban youth homelessness. We found that people were moving, right? They were so they'd be in school until they couldn't be in school anymore because they had to pick between staying in their community and being housed or having a place to go or having the support, and they'd largely end up on the highways. And the thing is, it's kind of interesting. I mean, in Niagara, you come down the highway, you hit St. Catharines, and we have a 10 to 24 bed shelter, and then another half an hour, 45 minutes down the road, you hit Hamilton, it's got a 50 bed shelter, and another 40, half an hour, you're in Toronto, and it's got a 100 bed shelter. So you can literally see how, as you sort of move from the more rural into the more urban, just the number of beds increase. And it's simply because that's where the flow is. And so really understanding the flow is important. For example, if you're running a program and you identified a school that you're going to sort of work in, but depending, like if you don't understand how the immigration, you might find that school, kids who become homeless might actually go to a different community. And so by you running your program there, you may actually be impacting that level of homelessness in that school, but you might not see it. And so maybe then you think the program's failing or isn't achieving results, but it's just because you didn't understand where the flow of people were. And so I think that's really important to understand where your clients are coming from, particularly if you're looking at impact at your agency level. One thing that we did find we would ask youth where they were from, and quite often they would say St. Catharines, although we knew they weren't actually from St. Catharines. But we found that once people sort of end up in the city, even for a very short period of time, if you ask them where they're from, they'll just say they're from wherever they happen to be. So a good sort of question was to ask them what was the last school they attended, or what was the school they attended when they started school. And that was a better indicator for us of where they actually had spent most of their time, especially, I mean, at 16 and that, they're pretty close to the school age, right? So that was a better way for us to understand their community, and allowed us to sort of have a deeper conversation about where they wanted to be. They want to be in St. Catharines. There's people in those other communities that we could sort of link you back to. So it was a really good question, and so we've added that in, and that's actually how we identify based on what they tell us, and then also where they said they were in school. So the big thing really was with this immigration was, again, right, we wanted to stop the victimization. We designed a system that forced kids to make choices between staying in community and traveling to unknown cities in order to access service. And that was the end of it. And then once you got there, we had absolutely zero ability or desire to send you back home, or even to look to, so there's no option. And so really, Youth Reconnect really was about supplying that option back to you. So if you think back to the quote that David had at the beginning, where there's a quote from a youth participant, and it said, we, being the youth and the worker, talk about what I want to do, and we actually go and do that. And so it's really about actual client choice. It's about giving the kids the option to make the right choices, not the choices that they have in front of them, right? Like, I know this is a shitty neighborhood, but this is what you can afford. So there you go. That's not a real option. So getting people back home was critical to us. And then we also get to that point of, again, noting the fact that kids didn't see themselves as homeless when they were doing this traveling process, right? So which just also led to their vulnerability. Next slide, please. So our referrals, when we started running the Youth Reconnect program, which you sort of saw in the video how it works, where we work with schools to identify kids who are before they were homeless, and then workers go and meet the kids at the schools or in their community wherever they're comfortable, and we do an intake and we sort of talk about what's going on and start the process there. Schools ended up being they have been and consistently remain the largest referral source for our program. At over 60% of our referrals are now have been and remain coming from schools, and these are largely the teachers and the guidance counselors in the school. VPs seem to be a critical component of in the school chain for us. They have quite a bit of responsibility for the youth we're working with. That seems to be in their portfolio. And then if you really think about it, it kind of makes sense, because after parents, the next group of adults that have good intentions for children are teachers. And so, why would we not rely on them? I mean, they're the ones, they're there every day, they see it. They, especially in the rural communities, they know these kids, they know these kids' families, they know these, the brothers and sisters have all been through. So they have a lot of knowledge, and, why waste all that knowledge? And so that became a big focus, and it's been, continues to be our focus. One thing to note, all schools have youth homelessness, or students who become at risk of all schools. Rich schools, poor schools, schools in good neighborhoods, schools in rough neighborhoods, academic schools, highly academic schools, vocational schools, all have about the same rates of homelessness when we start looking at our numbers. So largely what I found is that youth homelessness isn't a poverty issue per se. However, it is a poverty issue once you become homeless. And so it might not be a poverty issue when you started, but it definitely is a poverty issue afterwards. And so just something to think about also when you're designing a program, targeting at poor neighborhoods or really isn't where you're going to capture the biggest bang for your buck. Rural communities and schools. So I couldn't physically pick up the Raft and create a Raft in every community, right? There's 12 in Niagara, as I was saying. It would just cost too much. But every community, even the smallest of communities in Niagara, have a local high school or a school that sort of all those communities are around. And so the infrastructure is already there, and it's already staffed. And so all you need to do is make the connection, and you have your base of operation. We know that the majority of them are in the school, so it just all perfectly made sense. But that is a critical piece, is that, I've seen a lot of programs die on the table because, we design it and think, well, we can never fund it. It would just cost too much. So really take advantage of the fact that the infrastructure exists, regardless of, like, if you're looking at a Youth Reconnect program or just some program that does involve in a rural community, schools are critical. Because there's your infrastructure already in place, and so that became massively important, both from a financial, but ultimately financial led to success, because we could afford to do it, we'll be able to do it, right? And what we found is that when students are in trouble, if they can't talk to their parents, teachers are the group that they're going to talk to. So that's the next group of people that they trust, and they're going to, if they have a problem, they're going to sort of relate to and express it. So they know, again, back to that point around referrals from schools. This is the group, so you should really be involving them in your planning. Another thing is around the focus on family. Now, when I started back in 2006, I found there was a real push against the family. The family was seen as a negative influence, and here we have some stats actually that seemingly support that, and that I pulled off the top how 80% of youth conflict in family is the reason for their homelessness, and 67% it was a conflict with a parent. However, while all that is true, family is more than just mom and dad, or however you want to define your family, but it's all the kinship. So there's aunts and uncles, there's cousins, there's siblings. Each person has a ton of family. And so to not take advantage of that really became part of the critical part of our success. Really, we can't talk about affordable housing when we talk about youth if we're not talking about families. Because the majority of Canadian youth and North American youth, that's the same for the States, live in family. They live at home with their family. And so you're not going to build your way out. We can never create enough affordable housing units in order to house all the children if we took them all out of their families. And so if you want to talk about affordable housing and youth, we have to talk about families and kinship. And so that became a real, especially when we were looking around, and it became as a bit of a surprise for us, is that when we were working in the town of Fort Erie, which is fairly small, rents were higher than in the city of St. Catharines. And so that was, I mean, it makes sense, but we didn't, no, it's one of those things. So we had these kids, they wanted to get housed. There wasn't an option for moving back home, so we started looking around for apartments, and we couldn't afford them based on what OW, not that OW or welfare really pays enough to afford anything, but even on what they could afford, they couldn't afford it in Fort Erie. And so we ended up having to have rent subsidies. And so we started with rent subsidies. We had a donor who gave us money initially to be able to top up what we were able to give to the youth in accessing Fort Erie. And we had excellent housing attainment with the subsidy. I mean, it's amazing what happens when you can afford the housing. And so really, affordable housing is really only unaffordable for people who can't afford it. If you make it affordable, people will suddenly have housing. And so that was sort of the big aha moment for us, is that, you know, if people had the money, they could afford housing. Like I said, the system sucks. But clearly working with families is important. And it is, you're going to be your main driver for housing when it comes to the population you're working with. And importantly, and this will start to get to the thing that I think is a critical component, is this idea of identity and place. Family provides place. You might have issues with a family member. You might have a problem with a parent. You know, they might say that you're not a part of the family. You might be ostracized. At the end of the day, you're born into a family, and no one can take that away from you. And that family's history, that family's story is what makes us. And we do another program, and I didn't understand how important this was. I mean, it's always been important to me, how I've sort of related my early identity, you know, how decisions you make really played my family, who I thought I was, where I thought I came from, really formed my decision. So we talked to some kids. We were doing some programs where we were actually reintroducing them to family, largely that they'd been completely cut off from for a decade or 15 years even. So quite long. And we thought what we were providing for them was connections, like sort of practical things, like someone to talk to, someone to maybe take you for groceries, someone to explain things to you or give you a couple bucks or have a birthday party or whatever, right? But at the end of the day, what the kids kept telling me over and over again when we did our exit interviews with them, once they were reconnected to families, that I just wanted to know who I was. And it's like all of a sudden, all these other problems somehow become manageable simply because I have a background, I have a family, I have a history, I have a place in this world. I'm not just this mistake floating out there. So although family might not be, I mean, we do have to take precautions. We need to be obviously aware of the situation, but family is critical to providing place and identity. And so, and then ultimately, our other goal, one of the things we found was that two things were directly correlated in our research, our personal research that we were doing around chronically homeless adults, was that chronically homeless adults were likely first-time homeless as a teen and hadn't graduated high school. And so really the Youth Reconnect program is kind of at the nexus of that, right? So it's working with kids to prevent them from becoming homeless in the first place, so as a teen. And then because of that, it's really a school attachment program, which we'll get into a little bit. But I mean, there's really two ways of looking at this program. If you're from a housing homeless provider, you're looking at a homeless prevention program, a homelessness prevention program, but really on the other side, it could equally be labeled a school attachment program. So just something to think about. And also, if you're in a school, you're a student, and that's an identity, right? And again, like this identity thing, we really didn't understand how important it was. And I don't think we still at this day, I think this is where I am right now in my own understanding of how we're running services and how I'm planning for future programs, is this role that identity plays. And I'm getting into that a little bit. So next slide, please.
Actually, Mike, we're gonna do one more poll.
Okay.
So you've made some great points around the role of schools and connection to schools and how important that is. So we again are just curious to know folks' level of connection they have with schools right now, whether it's, for whatever reason you haven't had much connection, or maybe you have some solid relationships. I'm just going to do a time check. And Mike, do you think that by 2:15, we can move into like Q&A?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. I know you still have a couple more slides, so great. So we can check out the poll results. Oh, I don't know why I always am so surprised. I don't know what I'm expecting with the results. But so resoundingly, the majority of folks have some strong relationships and partnerships with schools, which is great, followed by some connections, room for growth, as there's always room for growth, and then a smaller percentage with no connection at schools at this time, and then a couple folks are not quite so sure. So that's amazing that folks have already established those strong partnerships, and maybe Youth Reconnect's another thing to chat with your school friends about. So let's launch back into the slides. Thanks, Lindsay. I think there's a bit of a lag. This next slide is a teaser, I think, is Youth Reconnect in action.
It's the things we can understand.
That's right.
And so as when we get to the slide, basically, again, the thing that we didn't understand about, there's been indications all the way through, and I've kind of hinted at them, is this idea of homelessness both being something that is a physical reality, but also becomes an identity. And that's the piece I really didn't understand, and it's taken a long time to come to this understanding of just what it means to be mental, or to be homeless up here. It's a mental thing, and it really is an identity. And because the roles of identities are so important in how we make decisions, to not consider the role of homeless identity is critical. So one of the things that Youth Reconnect does, that by a prevention program, it keeps kids as students. They never identify as homeless, right? I mean, we know that going in, that they only become homeless after the fact, and not even physically. It's after a prolonged time of homelessness they become homeless, as an identity. And so it's a lot easier to house students than it is to house kids who are homeless. Even if I just say, even if we go out and we talk to landlords and we say, we got this, we have this student working, is having some trouble with housing. You got students hit on hard times, doors open, people are willing to, to go out of their way to try and help us. But you go in and say, I have this youth, he's been homeless. All of a sudden, well, maybe, what's he into? And is this just going to be trouble? And, I want to sort of stay away from that. So we know it's true. I mean, we relate to people based on their identity. And so it really does affect how the program delivers. And then, like I said, the best thing about a prevention program is that it stops the identity from being able to form in the first place. And one thing just to kind of quickly pick up on identity is that it sets that framework. So it has norms and acceptable things that happen within it. And so things like having a street family, no privacy, that's a norm. Like there's no expectation of privacy when you're homeless. No personal possessions. Also, there's no expectation that you own anything. Anything can be taken from you at any time. And you could take anything you want also at any time. But one of the things we had when we ran like Housing First programs, we're working with kids who are chronically homeless. We'd get them into apartments, but then they'd break the apartment system down. Like they'd end up becoming homeless, they get evicted. And we couldn't quite understand it, but it's when you actually think about it from this perspective, well, we just because we provided you a physical place to live, if your identity is still homeless, then your identity and your situation don't match, and you go back to where you're comfortable, which is what we all do, right? We're all looking to be comfortable, and our identities have to match what we find ourselves in. And so I think we can go 2 slides. So the one slide I passed is just a kind of overview of the Youth Reconnect program in action. And I think between what we've been talking about and then the video, that you probably have that. And like I said, there's ways you can get that information if you really wanted to follow up about like the on the ground stuff. But just kind of a couple things. So I think this is one of the things that potentially people were interested in, just how to work with schools. And just a couple points. We started off Youth Reconnect with one school in Fort Erie that we were working with, and it was largely driven because there were a couple teachers who were just out of their minds because they were working with these students, and then these students would just disappear, and they'd never know what happened to them because they were gone. And you know, it's actually creating quite a bit of trauma for the students, this relationship. And so, you know, when we were sort of down there looking for solutions, and then this idea of a partnership came up, they were more than willing to work with us because they realized that there were limits to what they could do. And so, and it wasn't about adding to their responsibility, it was really about complementing their strengths with our strengths. And so that's really part of it. It's a complementing of strengths. It's not about overloading the school with extra work. That's not what we're trying to do. And so as we were successful and as we were able to build on that success, the school itself became a champion within the system, and it slowly built from there until the point where we were actually in every school, you know, across Niagara. It's a long process. It takes time. You're building relationships, right? On the other side, we did a different program, not Youth Reconnect, but a different program where we actually, because of the relationship we already had, we had access at the school board level to bring in this new program. And the thing I would say, if your access is from the top and not the grass, really what you want to be asking is, here's my program. Of all your principals or all your schools, which schools do you think are most likely to want to work with us? And so you're really looking for them to use their knowledge of, because one of the things to learn about schools is principals run their schools. It's a fiefdom. And so they will, if a principal doesn't want your program, even if the school board is saying the program is going there, it's not going to be successful. Principals and janitors, those are the two people in any school you need to be spending the most time with, because either of them will destroy your program. And so really what you're looking for is that person to say, okay, we know the schools, we know what you're trying to do. These are the principals that I think we're going to have the most in common with wanting to see this happen in their school, and that makes it a lot easier. And it's also nice to get the introduction, you know, from the superintendent. So there's some benefits there, but both sides can work. It's just slightly different on how you go about it. But ultimately, it's about building connections and being successful, and not trying to overload the school, because I mean they're always being asked for research, and you know, so they're very, you know, guarded about who they let in and who they sign up for, because they don't want to end up with all this extra work. I mean, they still have to teach, right? And then critically, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, it's about language. And so, you know, if I'm coming to you and I'm saying, I got this great homeless prevention program, and, you know, I mean, as a caring citizen, you may say, oh, that's wonderful, but, you know, everybody's got their own day, and I already got my own job. So that's where it's actually thinking about it from their side, like what is the program results that you're offering to them, not to you. So stop approaching it from what's the benefit to me in this relationship. Let's look at what the benefit in this relationship is for you. And so really the benefit in this relationship for you is that it's school attachment. It's school attachment and it's graduation, which are two critical components to going to school. So when you start talking that language, suddenly it's a completely different understanding. It's a completely different room. And you'll find you have a lot of people on board that are willing to spend the time with it. So I imagine that's probably true, not just at schools, but just, you know, instead of looking at from what you're trying to achieve, if there's a way that you can think about what they're going to get from this also that'll help them achieve their goals, I think you're a long way through. And then just a quick point on rural communities. One, you really need to understand the community. You can't just assume it's your city just with less people. I would suggest, if you can, hire a local, particularly, especially if they're young enough, for like a Youth Reconnect program, if they've actually attended the school. That was a huge win out the gate. Not that we necessarily strategically thought of it, it just happened to happen, but I can tell you, when I walked into a room and I was talking to schools and it was just me from St. Catharines talking to the people in Fort Erie, there's still definitely an us and them feel in the room. But then when Lindsay, who was our first Youth Reconnect worker and now the manager for the whole program, she actually went to that school. So suddenly it was like, Lindsay who went to school here, and it was just a really nice um, vibe in the room, and we were able to come to some very good understandings with trust already pre-bought, right? So I think that's just a quick, easy one. And the thing is, you can't rush rural. That's other thing. You can push all you want, and the more you push, you'll just be slowed down. So there's no way to rush rural. You just have to go with the flow and take success and build on it when it comes. Because once they actually decide to move, it'll move quickly. But if you push, you'll just be seen as a city guy in this big city ways. So
That makes sense. Like, I wonder if we can squeeze in a couple minutes with Dave just to switch gears a little bit. Sorry, I'm cutting you off a little bit, but we've got about 10 minutes to chat a little bit about the COVID lens. I mean, there's so much insight you've given us in so many, from schools to working in rural communities to youth and identity. I think that other one big thing that people might be wondering is, like, what does this all mean in the midst of COVID? And I wonder if we can spend maybe, like, what are your highlights? And I'll offer to folks, I mean, I hope we get maybe time for a couple questions. Worst case scenario, we're open to hearing directly from folks after the webinar. If people want to follow up with us, we're happy to arrange like a small group chat for folks who might want to have some more sort of targeted questions. So if we don't get to questions, we're offering that in lieu of, but hopefully we'll get time for a couple. So coming back, if we can talk a little bit about Youth Reconnect and COVID. I'm not sure who wants to jump in first, because there's some different ones that we could come up with this.
Maybe I can just highlight quickly the second youth sector survey report and where I feel Youth Reconnect fits within it. So in Away Home and the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness issued 2 surveys to community practitioners and leaders and frontline workers. And we released the second survey report last week. And the second survey report really spoke to not only the gaps that communities were seeing in light of COVID, but also foregrounded the need for some specific areas of focus for recovery. And so within the report, there are 4 focus areas that we gleaned from the content from community stakeholders around what those focus areas need to be. And there's 3 specific ones that have a relationship to Youth Reconnect. And they are, the need for obviously systems and policy change around specifically the lack of coordination and integration at community levels. And we saw that in COVID. And so we saw the need for better communication. We saw the need for better integration of communities, of community programs, but also the relationships between programs needed to change. We also saw a gap in existing youth-centered interventions. And so what does that mean for young people who were now not able to access resources? And then how are they then supported in place at home while isolating, those kinds of things. And again, those aren't just COVID realities, in that we've always known that there's been a lack of youth-centered interventions that were needed for young people. And we also saw that there was a need for supporting the sector better. So that this would be the youth homelessness serving sector, and how do we do that better? And so as we layer on top of that, this opportunity that Youth Reconnect can provide to communities and when I say community, I want you to think about schools within that community as a building block for how to support recovery and how to support better integration and better communication across the system. We know, and our good friend and mentor and colleague, Dr. Steve Gates, always talks about it, for every young person who was homeless, they were once in school. And so there was a missed opportunity for us to engage with that young person and provide them with the tools, or their family with the tools, to ensure they didn't enter into homelessness. And so if you, and this is a common question that I get, and probably lots of people get it, if you were to build one thing in recovery, if you were to insert one thing into community within recovery, and my answer now is Youth Reconnect. And because it is that component of the system that can pull these maybe misaligned or relationship components that are necessary for the system's response to be successful together in order to really better serve that individual where they're at and where they need to go.
Great. Mike, I wonder if you want to kind of respond, follow up to that. Lindsay's just letting me know we do have a couple questions, so I wonder if we can maybe, yeah.
I'll make a couple of quick points just reiterating basically what David said. So what we were able to do immediately once the pandemic hit, I think one of the large tragedies of this whole pandemic thing is going to be the fact that how many services, just when people needed them most, just stopped. And it was just a complete wipeout of services initially. And so one of the things we were able to do, because we are mobile and already out in the community, is that we just switched to wellness checks. So everyone, suddenly we stopped worrying about the housing focus so much, and we just started making sure that people were well. You know, you're isolated, all your services have stopped. Are you just well? Along with that, we were able to supply COVID information, so up to date. So weekly, we were calling everybody on our caseload and saying, you know, here's the latest information that's coming from public health. And so, you know, what are your fears? What are your concerns? And here's the actual information. And then for some, because of just, you know, where they were in a place of fear and anxiety, quite often we were dropping off groceries because they just wouldn't leave their homes. And so they needed supplies. And I mean, that was the same for a lot of people, right? But imagine if, you know, you're sort of homeless or newly housed and you don't know anybody, you're new. So that became a huge piece of it. And then at the end of in May, during the heart of our sort of, you know, the first wave of COVID for us down here in Niagara, we were able to house 10 youth in the month of May during the pandemic. And so, you know, all of that was based on the work that, because Youth Reconnect, because of the way it's designed, was able to, you know, agilely move and really support the youth. So I think those are our biggest wins.
That's great. Awesome. That's actually perfect timing. We have 4 minutes left. So Lindsay, I'm going to flip to you. And if you want to share those questions, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. So we've got a great question, and this one's from Mike. So Marie M is wondering the difference between the Youth Reconnect program and Youth Connection and diversion and homelessness. And then there's a second part to the question. Marie is wondering if there's a connection between those two, like the YR program and upstream Housing First for Youth and Family and Natural Supports.
And we only have 4 minutes? That's the next webinar. But quickly for myself on diversion and Youth Reconnect, it depends on what you see as. I mean, when I see diversion as a program, and not. I mean, it could mean a lot of things, right? So when I'm talking diversion, I'm talking about a sort of a programmatic diversion. So Youth Reconnect I see as more prevention, and so we're meeting kids often before they require diversion. And then that's prevention to me. Where diversion I see is at the door. We've missed you in prevention. Somehow you've gone through the net, and this is our last attempt at diverting you at this point from shelter. It's not about saying no to shelter, but it's about saying, is there something else other than this? And so really that's how I see the two programs working. Like youth would be farther up the stream, and then diversion would be right at the door.
Yeah, Mike, if I can interject for like 1 second, Marie, that's a really great question. And I said to Mike, I was like, someone's going to ask you how you coordinate all these different services. But so in Hamilton, the Youth Reconnect demonstration site there has a similar setup to the Raft. They also have youth-specific diversion supports, and have also sort of made sure to coordinate so that, yeah, Youth Reconnect is, and I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, Youth Reconnect Hamilton. Youth Reconnect is definitely the more upstream, even trying to connect with youth that are 13. Versus shelter diversion is more at the door. But if you want to chat more about that, please feel free to connect and we can chat a little bit more with you about that. Great question, though.
Yeah, and great distinction, Mike. Yeah. We have time for one more?
We have 2 minutes. Yeah, I think we probably have time for one more. So we've got a question from Avery S. So it's regarding primary housing options. How does the project address youth aging out of foster care?
Yeah, so we actually have, in addition to Youth Reconnect now, we have a provincially mandated program called Youth in Transition. And so prior to that, Youth Reconnect was our main program for working with kids who are also aging out of care, because it just worked with anybody that needed housing. And so, like I said, the focus on the family is important. And also with youth aging out of care, the family was also important. So seeing if there was a way to connect it back to family. And this is what actually we run another program. That's where these kids that were coming in that had not talked to any family for 15 years. And so really the intervention is the same for us. We start from the same place, but it's ultimately youth led. So, you know, it's really offering them what they want. But we do have a new program now, which is specifically only for kids who have been in care or had experiences with Crown Wardship. So.
Great. So just looking at the time now, Erika, do you have any last words or anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I mean, I think I covered it. Our main thing is for folks. Well, first of all, big thanks to Mike for, I feel like we could have talked for days on this stuff. We've got so much experience underway and so many different angles we come at this. So thank you so much. And we really do encourage folks, check out the Youth Reconnect guide, get in touch with us if you have any feedback, if you have questions. We're happy to, as I said, to have those sort of group chats, and also check out the doc, the others. We're doing a duo launch today, not really a launch, but the other education report, and you'll find all the resources in the slide deck here, because there's lots of good information and resources there to check out as well. So that's all from me.
Just want to thank you for giving me the time to talk about this program. I mean, it's definitely part of what I love to do.
That's great. We feel your passion, Mike.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all three of you for being here today, and for everyone in the audience. And just a reminder that you'll get an email with the recording from this webinar, as well as the PowerPoint slides. I know we kind of glossed over a few of them, so you'll get a chance to go back through the PowerPoint presentation to see anything you might have missed. And you should expect to get that within the next week. So again, thank you so much to everyone, and have a great day.
Amazing. Thanks. Bye, everyone.